is the last live session for this year's massive open online course on future of farming and food. In the last module, the last week, we talk about action for change. And one of the topics we discuss is the importance of investing in science and technology, and perhaps also not just the importance of it, but also doing it maybe slightly differently in the future. There's a number of issues there. So the first one is, of course, at present, all over in the world, more than 70 million or billion US dollars are being invested in agricultural R&D. About half of that by public sector or from public sources of funding, and the other half from the private sector. There's, of course, a difference in terms of what the public sector invests in, more fundamental science, more public goods type of research, as compared to the private sector, which, of course, needs to look for market opportunities and the associated research that leads to then intelligent products and services. So they both have to play a role in this overall picture. There is clearly demonstrated benefits from investing in science and technology and the associated also human capacity building. The rates of return whenever economists do these kind of studies are very high. And so sometimes it is surprising why governments actually don't invest more in it, because agricultural science is one of the most rewarding when it comes to those benefits. So we see a huge diversity. There's a few countries that invest very large amounts now in agricultural research, but there's many, particularly in the lower income countries in the world, that only account for a very small proportion of the global agricultural spending. But at the same time, of course, also have to, one way or another, get access to new knowledge and new technologies or better skilled people. So the numbers that have been cited often is that R&D in low-income countries is only about 3% of the global public sector agricultural R&D, and that's obviously not enough. So, but what I really wanted to talk about today is not so much the question of how much should be invested in this kind of research, but more also the question of what we need to be differently to be more effective in it. Because, of course, we know that agricultural research is a very sort of slow process. Usually takes 15, sometimes 20 years or more from an idea to some kind of prototype that then could be commercialized, and then it takes another 10 or 15 years until it gets commercialized and reaches significant levels of utilization by farmers. So that's a very long time period. And when you put it all together, you're talking about 25 years for many of these technologies, and that's far beyond the time scale that we are looking at when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, which we want to achieve or at least make big progress for by 2030. So that's only 11 years left. So we need to do things maybe differently, and I think that's where new ways of working, new thinking and innovation comes in, so that we can take more rapidly advantage of what also might be possible with new technologies nowadays. And so my guest to discuss this is Adrian Percy, and I want to start out by asking him a bit more of his background, where he comes from, how he grew up, what his professional career was, and then maybe hear a bit what he's currently doing in this space. Adrian, over to you.
Thanks, Achim. Hi, everybody. Real pleasure to be with you today and talk about some of the exciting new things in innovation in agriculture. And actually, I wanted to start by saying that this is actually a really golden age, in my opinion, in agriculture. There is a lot of new things going on, a lot of exciting new technologies. And of course, as you said, Achim, those are really needed if we're going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals that have been set out before us. Just to give you a little bit of my background, I'm a Brit, grew up in the UK. I have almost zero farming background in terms of my family or agriculture. I have an uncle who is a dairy farmer, but that's about it. I actually grew up in central London, and when I was looking at career choices at the time, I don't think agriculture was probably, hitting very high amongst them. But I went to university, I studied toxicology. I'm a human toxicologist by training. And then I started, as I exited university in the UK, I was looking for a job. And to be very honest, my number one goal at the time was more about getting out of the UK and experiencing a new way of life and a new culture somewhere interesting than actually, what was I actually going to do? So I ended up working at one of the agrochemical companies that actually no longer exists because of consolidation in our industry. It's a company called Roncolenc. And I moved to the south of France, which is a great place to start your career if you've ever been down there. And at that point, I started to get my first experiences in agriculture. And, coming from toxicology, a career path for me at the time would have been to go perhaps into pharmaceuticals or into chemistry. A few of us ended up in agricultural chemistry like myself. And so it really was an interesting kind of exposure that I had to agriculture, and then, starting to understand first through just local visits to farmers in places like the Rhone Valley or the Camargue where they grow rice. But then as my career developed, I got the opportunity to travel pretty much all over the world and see, different agricultural systems and productivity systems in places like Brazil and Argentina, United States, Canada, India, China, Japan. Some really, really diverse ways of doing essentially the same thing, which was to grow food. I stayed within the agrochemical business, within an R&D function for roughly 25 years, so a long time. Eventually, I became head of regulatory affairs, which was a really fascinating position, learning how these technologies, have to get registered, the time it takes, the money it takes to register things like an agrochemical or a new plant trait, and actually in the case of a plant trait, to actually get it registered around the world so you can actually have freedom of movement of crops to all parts of the globe. Then after that, for the last 4 years, I was actually head of research and development for Bayer CropScience, which is one of the big players in what we call the ag input industry. And just to give you kind of a flavor of the amount of investment we were doing, we invest, or they invest, around about 12% of their net sales in R&D, which equates to about a billion euros per year, with a team of about 5,000, headcount. So these are a mixture of scientists and technicians and support staff. But when you get up to those numbers, obviously it's a complex organization. It's working at a very large scale. It was actually spread across the world. So we have people in about 80 or 90 countries, sometimes doing very local things like making sure the products were right for the different geographies that we were selling them into. Other people were doing things like regulatory affairs. But then we had a whole slew of people doing basic discovery. And what we were doing there, we're looking for new crop protection chemicals, looking for new biologicals, mainly in the form of either bacteria or fungi, but also looking at developing certain crops, new seed varieties, which were very high performing. Some of these were actually GM, which is a whole new debate, a whole other area to get into. And some were non-GM, like for instance, in the vegetable seeds that we had. I left Bayer at the start of this year. And one of the reasons I did that was because during my time in Bayer, I started to get very excited about a lot of the new technologies which were evolving outside of the company. And these were driven by some incredible technology tailwinds like gene editing, digitalization, new types of growing systems, just generally artificial intelligence and machine vision and machine learning, and how those can be applied actually to agriculture. And I started to work with some of these companies even before I left, and since then I've kind of created or working with a portfolio of different ag tech startups, as we would call them. And these range across a whole different broad category of different technologies. And I'm also actually working with a venture capital fund, and maybe we can talk about that as well, because I think what's really interesting in our industry and what has happened really since only about 2013 is that we've seen an enormous influx of investors getting interested in agriculture. They're getting interested because they see a big opportunity. I mean, many of these are businesses, but also because they see from a sustainability and from an impact perspective, the need to advance productivity, need to advance sustainability, and also the need to improve the quality and nutritional value of our food, and also to make sure it gets where it's meant to be. And so a lot of people have been inspired, I would say, by this great story of and this great challenge of feeding 10 billion people by 2050, and doing it actually on less land than we have available to us today, and then doing it under all of the constraints of fewer resources like water or labor, which is a big issue in many countries, finding people who actually want to work on the farm nowadays. But also doing it in the conditions of climate change and seeing different disease pressures and pest pressures. So it's a really interesting time to be in this business for all the things that are going on, but particularly I think because with the new technologies which are sometimes emerging from other sectors like the pharmaceutical sector or the engineering sector, being able to apply those to agriculture and being supported by a new investment community, also by the big companies who are also investing heavily, and also, of course, academics that are helping moving things along and finding actually new starting points in many cases. It's a really great time to be in this business.
Yeah, very fascinating career. So before we get a bit more into technologies and other things, so what we've got now is the ecosystem that has public sector research of the kind that we do in my institute. Then you have the big companies of the Bayer and the others, where there is a lot of movement always on mergers and acquisitions, and so sometimes people get scared of that too, in terms of two big companies dominating things, And then of course we've got the innovative startups and other entrepreneurial things. So do you feel that we're working already effectively together in this kind of ecosystem as a new model, or what else could we do to do this better?
Well, I think it's emerging. So we would say that this ecosystem and all of the different elements that you mentioned, academia, impact investors, foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation, which are part of it, the venture capital investors, the small companies, the startups, but also the big agricultural giants, whether it be a Bayer or a Corteva or a BSF or a Syngenta or some of the big food companies like Cargill and Tyson. I think this is kind of a time of kind of rearrangements. We're seeing lots of changes, as you mentioned, in terms of consolidation with the big companies. And that is, if you like, also creating opportunities for smaller companies to come in and sometimes, get into new markets or even take away markets from some of those big players. And then, of course, we've got academia, which I think is also in a kind of transformational moment as well, as unfortunately, public sector funding for agricultural research is going down. There is an expectation, at least in my impression, is there an expectation sometimes that academics should be more product focused, more output focused in terms of actually being closer to the grower. And so I think many academic institutions are kind of reevaluating how, what is their role within this whole thing. So there's a lot of change right now. Is it working effectively? I mean, I think to a degree, because to be honest, I mean, these are to a degree competitive activities and actually should be, because I think that, at least in the private sector, is what's actually going to drive innovation and progress is actually competition to a degree.
Yeah, I feel the same. I mean, a good amount of competition is good, but I also feel that sometimes it has become, at least in my world, which is more the public funded research, it has become a bit of a needless competition too. We're wasting a lot of resources on and intelligence people time on writing grant proposals and other things that don't get funded. Which is very smart.
I mean, one thing, maybe just to give you a picture of how R&D is done in the big companies, and maybe people listening can understand then a little bit the role of the smaller companies. So the big companies, are really huge now. So, Bayer, as an example, just paid $66 billion for Monsanto, which of course is a huge amount of money. It's actually one of the biggest cash deals of any acquisition in history, certainly the biggest acquisition by a German company. So just gives you a little bit of the scale of that. But within these big companies, they're going after big targets. They're spending a lot of money, and to actually recuperate that money, they have to go after, really major agricultural challenges. So one example would be, something like Asian soybean rust in Brazil, which, is a massive opportunity for some of the bigger companies to go after, and they can actually get their money back, if they find a product that really works in that kind of area. And that means that some other areas get a little bit neglected. And also, I would say that the big companies are very much, their R&D efforts are really machine-like. So they're building big platforms, testing sometimes hundreds of thousands of molecules in a year, both through their discovery platform and then putting them out into the field. So, it's an enormous effort. They tend to be working in areas where there are big hurdles for new companies to enter. So if you take an example of developing a crop protection chemical, estimates are that it costs up to $300 million to bring one product to market. And it can take up to 10 years to actually do that. So, a small startup that is basically working from year to year really struggles to challenge, in that kind of environment. But on the other hand, because these big engines in the big companies are working the way they do, very much focused on throughput and efficiency, what they lack sometimes is the agility to bring in new technologies. And that's where I think the real role is of some of these smaller companies to really work on breakthrough technologies that they can either bring to the market themselves or perhaps work with, with the big company to actually be successful. And of course, a lot of these early stage companies are actually being formed out of basic university research. And so it's a fascinating progression now. You see, researchers becoming entrepreneurs, and perhaps actually CEOs of small companies, and some of them will actually, be successful and become CEOs of bigger companies. Others perhaps will be unsuccessful because it is a very high-risk business. But some will be perhaps eventually acquired by medium-sized or larger companies. And so it's really great to see this kind of throughput of company creation and success going on with all these different elements kind of interacting.
Yeah, I'm quite excited about it too, actually. So there's a lot of hype and excitement about various new technologies. So in the areas that you work, in the startup world and the companies you interact with, can you give us a couple of examples of exciting new things happening?
Yeah, well, I can give you a lot. So I mean, I tried to pick some interesting sounding ones, but just to give you a kind of idea of the types of technology areas that people are investing in. So still things like crop protection and inputs, fertilizer. There are many smaller companies looking to bring new solutions in that area, and sometimes to actually bring disruptive solutions. And a great example is fertilizer. So there is a lot of concern around the world about the effectiveness of synthetic fertilizer. A lot of it is basically put into the environment without any real use because it's not taken up by the plants and can actually end up in water systems and other things. So companies are looking at alternatives to synthetic fertilizer or making the current synthetic options more effective. So there's one big area of research, and I can give you a couple of examples of companies working in those areas. There's companies working in the plant science areas, particularly a lot of companies working with new gene editing tools. I'm very excited about that, but I have to say also worried about regulation, particularly in Europe, how that whole thing will play out. There's a lot of companies working, I would say, in the kind of what we would call precision ag area. So these comprise of companies which are dealing with imagery systems or companies with sensors. And then, of course, they are combined with digital tools in equipment that may be specialized as well to increase effectiveness on the farm. And then another area I think is really interesting is is indoor farming, so vertical farming, which some may say is one of those areas that's been hyped a little. But this is about bringing actual nutrition into city areas, providing, for instance, the availability of fresh fruits and veg in urban environments, which are basically food deserts in some cities around the world. So just to give you specific examples, one company working in the fertilizer area is called Join Bio. This is a company that's based out of Boston. What they're trying to do is to engineer microbes to actually fix nitrogen. And they want these microbes to grow symbiotically with crops such as wheat and corn. And they're using basically a synthetic biology approach to achieve that. And their hope is to replace or to supplement synthetic fertilizer use. So that's one example. I'm working here. I'm actually talking to you from Ghent in Belgium at the VIB. I'm working with a company here called AgroSafe, and they're basically a biopesticide company. What they're doing is developing highly active biopesticides, and they're derived actually from antibodies, which are extremely specific and extremely active on different pests and diseases. And of course, essentially after their activity, they're broken down into basic elements in the environment. So you don't have synthetic chemical residues at the end of the day on the crops, which is what a lot of consumers are pushing back on. Another example in the crop input area, kind of a company that always makes me smile when I talk about them, is called Zasso. They're based out of Aachen in Germany, and they're working on weed electrocution. So this is basically electrocuting weeds from a tractor as you go over the field to burn down weeds that may be nuisance weeds. But they could also have applications in urban areas perhaps as well, where the use of chemical herbicides has been banned by local councils and other things. So it's basically getting at the same problem with a completely different approach.
I hope it doesn't electrocute the earthworms either.
Yeah. Well, they don't, and they have tested that, and they're contact. They work by contact. So as long as they're only touching, the leafy parts of the plants, then nothing under the soil is actually impacted, apart from the roots of the plant.
So this brings me to two other subjects before we can start answering some questions from people coming in here. So and one is this question of regulation. So I fear that a lot of these good developments that are possible technologically will not move fast enough into the real world application, simply because we've gone in many parts of the world into a direction of regulation that is based on precautionary principles. Mm-hmm. So Europe is the most classical example for this, and particularly the opposition to things such as genetic modification, crop technologies that essentially have been in worldwide usage now for over 20 years. And we still haven't made much progress on this in Europe, and also not in Africa, for example, or even in Asia. So I think it relates to then the question, and how do we bring the public and regulators along in this kind of thinking to also build enough trust into these new technologies? What do we need to do differently?
Yeah, well, I mean, you've cited two great examples, and genetic modification of plants is a really sad story in many ways, and possibly could have been, the whole debate could have been avoided with other tactics and better communication by companies that were working in that area right at the start of the introduction of those new technology areas. And I think that's an interesting case study, and I'm sure everyone has opinions on it. But for me, there was two fundamental problems with how that was introduced, particularly in Europe. One was the fact that the companies believed that the important opinion maker in this case was the farmer, and were very, very active in convincing farmers of the utility and the value of the technology and the safety, and tended to ignore the fact that the consumers do have a say in this, and certainly are interested and curious about what they eat, and that of course there are groups who are going to exploit those situations also to to drive their agenda. So that was one problem. I think the second problem probably was that while GM, in my personal opinion, has undoubted value in terms of environmental sustainability, in terms of increasing productivity, almost exclusively all of the traits which were brought to market were actually for the benefit of farmers in many ways, and not for the benefit of the consumer. And so if you contrast that now with the advent of gene editing, I think if you go and look at some of the companies working in this area, almost all of them are exclusively looking at beneficial traits to consumers. And they're working in crops of value to consumers. So these may be high nutritional value crops. It may be or solutions. A great example is a company called Calyxt in the US that's just released the first gene-edited crop into the marketplace, which is a high oleic soybean oil. And this has properties a little bit like olive oil, and you can use it in different ways than standard soybean oil. That's a great example. There are other companies working, in the area of fruit and veg, where they believe they can, produce products which look better, which taste better, which have more nutritional value, which have better shelf life, which they believe that consumers will value. So I think for me, it's very much about engaging, with consumers early, and with all stakeholders in this whole thing, which would be regulators and policymakers, politicians, NGOs, engaging with them early, being transparent about the technology, but explaining to them not in a highly technical manner always, but in a way that they can appreciate and understand if they're non-scientists. And I think, again, we as scientists, and I guess many of the people listening have scientific background, sometimes fall into that trap. But the other thing I think is showing people that there's actually a value to doing this. And the value could come in many forms. It could be of, as I've said, of value to the consumer. It could be of value to the environment as well, in terms of, bringing, traits that, for instance, use less fertilizer, or are controlling a disease which actually threatens a whole crop, like bananas, or perhaps is helping a crop which may be threatened by climate change, like coffee. I think these types of things maybe are more appreciable to consumers and to the public than perhaps a trait which just enables the farmer to use a herbicide more effectively.
So besides the sort of gaining public trust and support and the regulatory side of things, the other area that could be a major constraint for many new technologies is intellectual property.
Yeah.
How that is being managed, and most of us who work in research experiences, when you do 10 or 20 years of research on something, and of course many others work on that same kind of thing too, then often you don't quite exactly know anymore who owns what, and people get engaged in all kind of legal battles and types of things, which then often also prevents the wider usage of new inventions. So I feel like we need to do some rethinking there too, and work more in an open innovation context, as opposed to be very protective. But of course, at the same time, there's also a need to commercialize things. So how do we get out of this dilemma?
So I think you're absolutely right, and IP and intellectual property is a huge issue. A great example is many of the Western companies are very, very reluctant to go to China and work in that environment because they can't control their IP, and they're worried that their IP will fall into other people's hands and be used, against them almost. But I also believe that, a lot of these big tools should really be available to everyone. And so again, going back to the example of gene editing, and particularly around CRISPR-Cas and the massive IP battles which are going on between, Berkeley and the Broad Institute, but also between companies trying to secure a position. I think most people believe at the end of the day that these technologies will actually become available to everybody, maybe at a price, but what will distinguish people using them is the way they execute and use those technologies, how fast and effective they are. And I'd much rather, to be honest, be working in a company that is really at the top of their game in terms of driving through in a very effective and efficient manner on a particular technology, and outpacing everybody else to be successful, as opposed to perhaps just having a nice piece of IP that you sit on, that people can work around in any place, in any case, in many cases. So
good.
For me, it's about execution.
We'll start with a simple question from Hamdan. In Ghana, currently it has been difficult to accept GM in our crop and food varieties. What do you suggest?
In which country?
Ghana. Yeah.
Oh, that's a very complex, and I thank you for the question. I know it's not an easy one to start with, but again, I mean, you know, it's very interesting to see in African nations the uptake and the interest in GM, and I know there are many you know, entities who are very keen because they believe that GM can help take agriculture and productivity in some of those countries to the next level. What I believe is that, you know, to achieve that, it's going to have to really be a multi-stakeholder coalition. It won't be big companies who can push the technology into a country. It will be, I think, politicians and NGOs on the ground, and companies, and big companies, small companies, perhaps researchers working together to build public trust, public confidence, both at the public level but also at the government level, and to basically build a system that can support the use of these types of products. And there are, of course, in many African countries, those efforts are underway. You know, there are organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that are very involved in that kind of effort. But it's not an easy fix, and it's not a short story. And I'm sure there's going to be sometimes cases where, you know, we take 2 steps forward and then a step back, and then we move forward again. And you know, it's very interesting. I know you're probably very familiar with the tale of golden rice as an interesting example. You know, which finally now this is getting out there, but it has been an enormously long story, but for many reasons, technical reasons as well as political reasons. But obviously there was a determination to keep on working on this, and I think kind of that is needed: determinations and patience, and a long-term plan to achieve some of this.
But yeah, since you mentioned golden rice, I remember I had a conversation with the Minister of Agriculture in Bangladesh about 6 years ago about this, and I asked her, Madam, you know, will you support golden rice as a solution to improve food and nutrition in your country? And she said that yes, I will support it as long as I'm sure from your side that the science behind it is done very well. It is my responsibility to feed my country. That is not the responsibility of many NGOs who oppose these technologies. So I believe we're now at a stage where Bangladesh will probably become the first country to release golden rice. I'm not quite sure whether it will still happen this year, but maybe next year. Yeah, but it is because of a consistent long-term effort and essentially a coalition of the kind that you have mentioned. Irina asks about dietary change habits. Do you have any good examples of startups working to induce dietary changes, or is it not a space that you're?
Yeah, there's a lot of people working in that area, and I guess there is. I mean, just on the top of my head, there are 3 main areas that I see. One is you know, alternative proteins, and you know, there are food companies like Impossible Burgers and others working on higher protein peas and other lentils and other basics. And I think this is driven by, you know, a couple of factors. I think it's driven by the desire for people to move away from animal protein to plant-based protein, but also, you know, concerns around the ethical treatment of animals, and that also leads into another area, which is, you know, clean meat. You know, lab-based meats, which is incredibly fascinating, given our discussion earlier about, you know, do the public want to accept technology in their food? The idea of having a lab-based burger is really interesting.
Have you had a chance to eat any of these new things already?
I have not, but certainly the clean meat. I think if you have a burger, it's going to cost you about $250,000 right now because it's so expensive to produce. but I've certainly had an Impossible Burger, and I've had some alternative meats, I would say, and very good. But I have to also say, a bit biased, I think it's good depending on the sauce that you have it with. Sometimes it's certainly, they're not quite at the point where the meat is it's a really convincing substitute, but it does provide the protein that we need in our diets. And going back to the actual clean meats, I mean, I think it's fascinating that people are actually now moving even on from basically trying to produce a burger patty to actually produce something that resembles a steak with not necessarily a bone in it, but certainly with different textures and more structure than some of the earlier versions. So that's already advancing, but I think for me it's going to be curious to see how the public embraces that. And then the other area I see a lot of effort going into is around new systems for growing fruit and veg. And again, I mentioned the vertical farms. I think they're really interesting. Companies like Plenty and Aero Farms, Bowery, who are investing very, very heavily in building these vertical farms, predominantly right now for leafy greens, so things like kale and spinach and other things, with the idea that you can actually grow these in an urban environment and actually deliver them fresh, within a few hours to a supermarket or to someone's home. Even ideas of actually building these growing stations in supermarkets or on top of supermarkets or underground supermarkets, so you can actually basically have your fresh food within a few minutes of it being harvested. And of course, with the growing systems that they're developing, they can produce a lot of food if you compare with what you would do on a conventional greenhouse or in the field. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see if they can have a financial model that goes beyond just producing leafy greens, and they start to produce things like tomatoes and berries and other high value crops that people want kind of delivered in a fresh way. But also, as I said before, there are many parts of even big cities like New York and other places where people often live very, very far away in terms of transportation distance from access to fresh food. You wouldn't think it, but it certainly does exist. So I think there's a lot of interesting kind of plays in that area.
Yeah. No, I come across many examples too. I remember last year I looked at a startup that was making home grows cabinets for growing your veggies in the kitchen, complete. That's everything. So yeah, I think these are all part of the general sort of trend towards people wanting to have more healthier diets of various kinds, and then of course if there's a market for this and people are willing to pay for this, then a lot of innovation will happen.
Yeah, I mean, some of the interesting innovation as well is around just food delivery. So I guess we're getting used to having pizzas and other things delivered to our door, but trying to reduce food waste and have an increased quality of food that can be delivered in a vending machine or something like that is really interesting. And there's a company in the US called Farmer's Fridge, which are basically now putting vending machines in universities and in workplaces, so people can actually get kind of a gourmet lunch out of a vending machine as opposed to a sandwich that maybe have seen better days. So I think it goes beyond just technology in terms of food production, but also into distribution and reduction of waste.
So here's an interesting question from Liz Ogutu. As an advisor to AgTech, do you think it is possible for the companies to partner with IT startups in sub-Saharan Africa so that we leapfrog our agriculture into the 21st century as happened in phone apps? Yeah.
So I think that's a great question, and personally, I worry because a lot of the focus of these startups is frankly in big Western markets in developed countries, and perhaps a little bit less in some parts of the world that actually perhaps need these solutions even more. But I think when it comes to digital solutions, actually there is some amazing technology that's being developed that will help Southeast Asia and African countries to do exactly as you're suggesting and to leapfrog maybe several iterations of products. And I was last week in San Francisco at a big AgTech conference, and it was really good to see that now I think a number of companies are actually focused on, for instance, African markets. There was a company there, for instance, that was building basically a virtual marketplace for farmers to buy seed and to buy crop protection chemistry, but to link that with an agronomic advice tool, and basically delivering agronomic advice through people's cell phones, but through text messages or through other means, and helping them. And it's just amazing, in fact, some simple advice on, for instance, weather, don't plant this week, plant next week, can have amazing outcomes on productivity and yield. And I think, in fact, many of these digital tools will perhaps be more transformational, perhaps in developing markets than they are in perhaps in established developed markets.
It's interesting because we are currently engaged in reviewing some of this work, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's been quite a few of these digital agriculture or digital agronomy initiatives around, not just sort of companies, but also through more of the donor-funded projects and other types of, but also some NGOs. So we were looking at this right now to see what has worked and what hasn't, particularly when it comes to scaling things up. It's that's the big question in terms of how do you not just reach a few thousand smallholder farmers, but essentially millions, and in the end, who's going to pay for it? So the business model for these types of things is probably the most challenging thing.
Yeah, and that frankly is why I think data is going to be so important, and why up until now the big companies have perhaps spent less focus on places like Africa, because basically companies thrive on getting information back from their customers so they can then help them make better choices and offer them different choices in the future. What has happened so far is in many African countries, and I'm speaking big generalization, I realize, is that it's a very diverse set. Companies are providing product, and the product basically is distributed through a very complex distribution system, but there's no feedback to the companies who are producing the technology. I think with a digital marketplace, you start to get an understanding of who is buying your product, how they're using it, how you may better serve them in the future. And I think, if that can be established, I think it will be opening the door, if you like, to a lot of other technology for the future.
Yeah. Now, I think it does require a few things, that at least our conclusion. So it also requires a much more significant amount and willingness also of data sharing, but also following similar data standards so that people can actually have access to real big data, not just their own data, mining those, but of course also honoring data privacy rights and other types of things. So it's a tricky field, but I also believe a lot is going to be possible in this space, and hopefully particularly also with applications in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world. Okay, let's see. We've got a whole range of questions here. There is a question here from Tang. Which strategies do you use to introduce your technologies in areas where new technology update is faced with bias?
Yeah, that's a great question, because one of the big hurdles for technology is adoption on the farm. And there are, I believe, many great technologies out there which have never been fully adopted by farmers. And that's probably, for many reasons. Some people claim that farmers aren't very entrepreneurial or risk takers, but I don't believe that at all, actually. I think it's one of the most highest forms of risk taking to be a farmer every year. I think, though, they are very pragmatic, and it's really important with new technology that you can demonstrate to them that it really does offer value, and that they're not going to lose their crop or lose part of their crop or be disadvantaged by trying something new. And of course, if you make a bad decision and a disastrous decision on a crop, it can have, massive impact on any farmer around the world. So there are some, I think in different markets and different opportunities there to kind of get the technology deployed. I think that one thing that's really important is that people who are developing these technologies actually consult with farmers and understand what farmers need and how they think before developing their technology, which you may be surprised to hear is not always the case. You may have someone coming out of an elite university in the US who thinks they know what a farmer needs or how they behave, and doesn't actually take maybe the time and the opportunity to actually ask them. And maybe that's a little bit unfair, but I've certainly seen examples of that. And even with the big companies, we do not always prepare the market adequately to have farmers understand, how to adopt technology. Another idea, there's a lot of financial tools now which are there to benefit farmers. Many of them are online tools. One example will be an actual insurance program where farmers actually pay insurance to adopt a new technology, and if it doesn't work out, the insurance pays out. So essentially, if they do lose their crop or part of their crop, they'll at least be compensated for it. And I thought that was a great idea to kind of help farmers to actually adopt technology. That's called Grower's Edge. But then there are other examples in places like developing countries where digital funding, quick loans are being offered to growers so they can actually buy or have access to technologies but that perhaps they haven't had access to in the past, and that might help also farmer adoption in certain cases.
No, I think I would support this and maybe add to this also because I, like many other researchers, have made the same kind of mistake. We come up with some great idea, and then we think, well, this is going to be the solution, and then we wonder why nobody wants to use it. And I think in most cases it is because we're making things too complicated, and so we're not actually the ones who would then be using it on a daily basis in the field. So my first advice to any scientist is try it out yourself first, and not just in the lab, but out in the field and over an extended period of time, because that's the only way to figure out what works and what doesn't. But I think we can, in the innovation context, also do a lot better in terms of using more lean science and lean innovation concepts of the kind that minimum viable products or prototypes are being developed very quickly and then exposed to the potential users and applicators. And then from then on, you go through a more iterative development cycle that is actually then resulting in a co-development process or a co-innovation process.
Mm-hmm.
And in each stage of it, in each cycle of development, you actually scale it up a notch already. So that by the end of this, you have a product, a technology that you have assured yourself that actually works at a larger scale and therefore has also a much higher chance of being desired and usable. So I think these types of lean innovation concepts we are actually trying to embed more in our science, actually, at Rosamstead too, but they're more typical in startup companies. And I think we can learn a lot from that or work together on that. So I've seen loads of inventions that people and very great ideas that people come up with that never make it anywhere.
Yeah, I think the whole point you make around simplicity and ease, I think it's not because farmers are stupid, it's because they are working, trying to make multiple decisions, trying to deal with multiple events, both on the farm, but also in their private lives, of course. And making it too complicated is just not something that they're able to spend the time doing. And I think, the early versions of a lot of precision ag tools, which was providing growers with enormous amounts of data.
Yeah.
If they had the time to sit down for a week and work it all out and think about it, perhaps they could make better decisions on the farm. But actually, what they need is something far, far more simple in real time that they can make a decision on, as opposed to something that perhaps they need to study for a while at home and then work out what they may do next year differently.
So, just to give another concrete example, I was once involved in the development of a software app for making fertilizer recommendations for rice. It was first called Nutrient Manager, now it's called Rice Crop Manager by Area in the Philippines. And so the way we came up with would essentially require a farmer or an extension worker to walk through this app and answer 15 or 20 location-specific questions. Now, these were simple questions for us, and we thought, yeah. And for most of these people, also still relatively easy to answer because you give them a few choices. But just the hassle of having to go through 15 or 20 questions until you come up with a fertilizer recommendation is for many people too much. So I think the solution in the future lies now to, okay, we still need to have an app that makes a very good and scientifically sound fertilizer recommendation, but maybe we can replace 12 out of these 15 questions with information that we pull together from many of the new kind of data sources and use a little bit of artificial intelligence, machine learning type of algorithms to actually answer these questions in the background without having to ask the farmer. So these are the types of things that hopefully will become possible, and then if we package them right into the right kind of front end and scientifically back them up to make sure that what's in that app is scientifically sound and validated and also reasonably transparent, we should be seeing much greater uptake of these things and hopefully then also more benefits for farmers directly. So that's my. So, okay, let's have another question here. We still have a little bit of time. Natalia Palacios is asking, what could we do different to improve the trust of the general public on science innovations? So what would you suggest to ensure ethics is put first on the innovation process?
Yeah.
Ethics first in the innovation process. How do we do this?
Yeah, I mean, it is a conundrum, I would say. I know many industry scientists, as an example, who are absolutely dedicated to their work, who actually are doing the work, yes, to feed their families with their wages, but also because they believe it has a higher purpose and are very, very motivated by it. But, as you imply, there is, vast sections of the public that do not always like, if we're working with GM technology or with pesticides or something like that. So, even though I think, there's plenty of evidence that, these things are safe, but I do think that companies have to start really putting their kind of the consumer in mind. Traditionally, a lot of companies have developed products, as I said before, with the farmer in mind, but I think now they have to really turn their attention to the consumer, and that could be, as I said before, in terms of the kind of features that these products have, but it can also be, is this type of technology that we're developing, is it really acceptable, or is it likely to be acceptable to consumers, irrespective of whether we're convinced that it's safe or not. So I think, trying to understand that mindset is going to be very important for academics, for industry people, but also for farmers. And, we're seeing now a real, what I would call a shortening of the food chain, where, farmers are having to adapt what they produce to consumer trends, and make sure that what they're producing, there's markets for it. So you're seeing a lot of companies, working in different areas to kind of meet those needs.
Good. Another question of a very different kind. This is quite a complicated one from Needy Rainer. So what do you suggest are the performance indicators of transnational supply chains to ensure sustainability? What innovations can help in closing the loop in a circular economy?
That is a complicated question.
Yes.
So shall I start and you finish off? I think so. I mean, I can't really answer the question maybe directly, but what I will say is that, within a lot of the innovation ideas and a lot of the startups that I talked about, supply chain is very, very heavily featured. And I think there is a lot of people trying to think about how can we make sure that we can get food to where it's really needed, or produce it where it's really needed, and preserve it, so it's not just being kind of just going to waste. And I think there's an awful lot of effort. I mean, when we talk about the 10 billion people and the 3 billion more that can arrive on the planet. Many of them are going to be in places where food availability is already compromised. So it's it's tremendously important that we think about it, but also to make sure that we can show how this food was produced and how it has been transported. That's pretty fundamental. And using technologies like blockchain and others, where you can actually basically certify, right from the start of the process, how did the farmer produce the crop? How did he or what did she use on that crop? What kind of seed? Where did it come from? How was the harvest done? Who harvested the crop? And then follow it through the food chain to make sure, for instance, that it was not stuck on a trailer in ridiculously high temperatures for a week sitting in a car park. But you understand exactly the provenance of your food. You understand the technologies that were used to produce it, and that retailers can then make best decisions on, making sure that food, as much of it as possible, really gets to the people that need it. And then conversely, in countries where perhaps storage is challenging, there is a lot of technology around, refrigeration and other things in the field, making sure that harvests are not wasted post-harvest because of poor distribution or storage. So I know I'm not totally answering the question, and I'm going to push it back to you, Achim, but that's at least some of the areas I've been interested in.
These are very good examples already. So I think there's a huge role, and there's already happening, of technology in the whole sort of supply chain, and from the field to the consumer's table, basically, and also closing the loop then in terms of what happens to food and other things afterwards. So I think there's definitely a lot of development, and it's more of a question of what is then the actual application of this. How much information do consumers want of this kind, or people in the supply and value chain? What is the right kind of information that also then helps them to improve the efficiencies and standards and sustainability standards in their businesses.
Yeah.
It's not just the farmer who has to follow stricter sustainable management practices and standards, but it's also, I think, all of the other actors in that entire supply chain that one way or another can benefit from that kind of innovation. So I think it, of course, will happen more for certain types of commodities first than others, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's still a bit of an open question of what the value of some of that is going to be for whom. And of course, there's also the question of to what extent some of these things may be enforced anyway by governments or other types of regulation.
Yeah, I think as you say, for certain fruit and veg, for instance, for a pepper or a tomato, it's relatively simple to follow its kind of provenance and its transportation. If you go to a commodity crop, then it gets far more complex.
So our time is nearly up, but I want to ask you one final question. So that's the $1 million question, or maybe that you choose. So if you had that amount of money right now sitting in front of you, where would you invest it?
Oh,
what would be your bet to place it on? And I'm very exciting.
Yeah. So that's a difficult question, but I think. And it's difficult because there is so much going on, and there's so many areas of investment of different technology areas. I personally am really excited about the opportunity to move from kind of a chemical approach to developing our food system to a more biological approach, and the ability to harness the power of microbes. For instance, things like the soil microbiome, to really understand, how these massively diverse and complex systems are working, and then use that to, produce better soils, to use that to protect crops in different ways and to help them be more productive. So, of all the things, there's many of them which will perhaps be even more transformational. I just find it fascinating to think that we can understand these complex ecosystems more and use it for our advantage.
Great. I think I would agree with this. That's also something that interests me. Well, time is up. So thank you everybody for joining, and thank you in particular, Adrian, for making an hour available. So I hope that everybody can take a few messages home from this, become innovators of any kind. And with that, have a good day, everybody.